Well, I would like to welcome us all and give us a moment to kind of settle in. I know that people are still joining, but to say welcome to this second in a series that we're calling Fracking BC, Reports from the People. If you're just setting in, you see on our screen there that let us know in the chat where you're from, the organization you're with, which First Nations territory you live on. And through the course of the hour and a half, we will be fielding questions and answers, and you'll see on your screen a Q&A section. And if you're wanting to put your questions in there, please do. So I'm Alice DeWolf, and I'll be sharing and co-hosting this session with Dolores Broughton, who is the editor of Watershed Sentinel, and I'm sure many of you are very familiar and know Dolores. To open, I want to honor and appreciate the Comox First Nation. We're hosting this event from their territory. And, as we learn about them, become friends with them, we're increasingly learning that the land, the air, the water around us, their beauty, their ferocity, their capacity to be abundant are absolutely inseparable from our well-being as individuals and as a community. And we increasingly know that that teaching is profoundly important. So Dolores and I co-edited the book, All Fracked Up, which many of you may have seen, which has just been released by Watershed Sentinel. It was intended to provide a resource for people who are not familiar with the critiques of natural gas and LNG, and to open up windows into the profound changes that are taking place in northern British Columbia. The bulk of the population in British Columbia lives in the south, and not a lot of us actually go up into that territory, in that part of the province. And the kinds of changes that are taking place up there are, I think, increasingly are not terribly visible to us. And they're certainly something that I think all of us need to understand is taking place. So the intent of these seminars are similar. We hope to open up discussions with activists and researchers that widen our understanding of the scope of fracking in British Columbia and its implications. If unchallenged, this industry will block the efforts by the rest of us to achieve any reasonable targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and will have damaged an unimaginable amount of fresh water, strangled agriculture, destroyed many First Nations efforts to strengthen their self-government, not to mention a whole other generation of efforts at reconciliation. We feel that the entire province needs to recognize these costs and that our tax dollars are heavily subsidizing them. So Dolores.
Oh, sorry, Alice wrote a script and I forgot to watch the script. It looks to me like there's now about 60 people who've joined us, which is not too bad for, a drop-off rate on a webinar. So, and there'll probably be a few more yet. And we're really happy that you were all able to come. And even an old friend of mine from Nicaragua is on here, which is amazing. And so we're asking you, if you like, to put where you're from in the chat panel so that we can share at least this, the connectedness of this kind of technology. Also, you'll see Corey Sandler, who's actually in here as admin. And if you have any technical problems, put them in the chat to admin, and Corey will try and help you with them. After we've heard from our presenters, we're going to open up for questions and answers. So if you put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen there, then we'll sort of compile them and push them out to the panelists at the end. And I have to ask you all to forgive us because we're still just learning how to run this stuff. So if there's glitches, well, that's the way it's going to be. We have asked for representatives from Maddie Lee or the Unistoten camp to join us, but that's not been possible. We know that there's COVID outbreaks in their communities, and that's probably absolutely terrifying. The Wet'suwet'en people the women are calling for the work camps to be closed. And we'd like to ask that you think about sending a letter to Dr. Bonnie Henry asking that she close the work camps, because absolutely those camps are helping to spread this COVID. I was looking at Northern Health, and there were 50 people from the Kitimat LNG project that did have COVID, and most of them got sent back to their communities to self-isolate. Now, that doesn't work very well. It just spreads COVID all over the place. So I highly urge everyone to support the Wet'suwet'en. And I will put the link for that information up in the chat in just a second.
So already someone has asked us a question whether the recordings are going to be up and available, and the answer is yes. The recording from the previous session is up on the Watershed Sentinel website. So that's watershedsentinel.ca. That's where the recording from this session will be. Last week, we were joined by three authors and activists, Owen Finn, Maud Barlow, and Peter McCartney. This week, we have another three absolutely remarkable people who have been working in this area, working on these issues for a number of years, and who helped us put together our book. But more importantly, they're helping us put together our kind of collective understanding of what the issues are related to both fracking and the growth that's anticipated with the LNG projects. They are, and you'll see them on your screen, Dr. Melissa Lim, Dr. Romain Chesneux, and Mitchell Beer. And we're going to start with Melissa, Dr. Lim. Would you just start by, setting up and sharing your screen?
Sure.
And as you're doing that, let me introduce you, okay? Dr. Lim is a family physician who also works in rural and remote communities across Canada. She's a board member of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment and is a clinical assistant professor at the University of Alberta. And Melissa, I don't know how you do all of those things. That's a remarkable combination. She's participated in policy and advocacy work around fracking, wildfires, climate change, clean energy, and the health benefits of time spent in nature. She's written for national media, academically, nonprofit organizations, and her chapter in All Fracked Up has given us an entry into the human health impacts of fracking through her interview with Dr. Meyer in Northern British Columbia. So Melissa, please take us into your presentation.
Great, thank you, Alice. I just want to point out that I'm actually at the University of British Columbia, not the University of Alberta.
Did
So
I say that?
yeah, that's
Did I say
okay.
that?
It's just that would be even more remarkable if I was
Oops,
able to
yes, it would be. I'm so
buy
sorry.
provincial or whatever.
Wow.
Anyway, so thank you so much. So to be honest, I moved to BC from Ontario about 5 years ago. And until I got involved with the BC chapter of CAPE about 3 years ago, I don't think I'd ever heard of fracking. The main focus of my environmental work over the past decade has been around connecting people to nature. But it's become so clear to me through my work with BC CAPE that fracking and the climate change associated with that are threatening people's ability to connect to the beautiful nature that we have here in BC and benefit from a healthy environment. So as you can see from this first schematic, just briefly, as many of you know, or some of you may not know, to create a fracking well, you drill a shaft up to 4 kilometers down into rock and then several more horizontally. And then you inject millions of liters of water, sand and chemicals under high pressure into the rock, cracking it to release gas deposits. Some of the fracking wastewater stays underground, and some of it, often containing heavy metals, carcinogens, and radioactivity, comes back up to the surface where it's stored in open frack ponds, kind of like tailings ponds from mining. And because it's expensive to treat, some of it's also injected back into the ground to store in deep injection wells indefinitely. And at multiple stages in this process, whether it's through flaring, as you can see, gas leaks, or fracking fluid leaks, fracking pollutes the land, water, and air with chemicals that are known to harm human health. And CAPE, in fact, released a comprehensive report on the health risks of fracking in January 2020 called Fractures in the Bridge that described links to health issues like preterm births, asthma exacerbations, and childhood leukemia, not to mention the impacts of methane leakage on climate change that will affect everyone's health. And what's even worse, that when fracking is done, many companies leave behind abandoned wells and untreated frack ponds, which in many cases no one is monitoring and no one is paying the cleanup costs for, which makes the risks of leaks and pollution even higher. So today in BC, over 85% of the natural gas we produce is in fact unconventional fracked gas. But as you've heard, there's nothing natural about liquefied natural gas in Canada because most of it comes from fracking. Oh, I think my slide is not advancing here. Oh, here we go. Okay. So since 1985, about 20,000 wells have been drilled in BC. And this map of wells in the Montney Formation shows that fracking is happening right in the middle of inhabited areas in the Peace region in Northeast BC. And because of the $40 billion LNG Canada project, which is the largest private sector investment in the fossil fuel industry in Canadian history, we could see up to 50,000 fracking wells being drilled in Northeast BC alone. So we have just heard about how fracking is devastating for climate change and environmental and human health, but many of these words and numbers don't feel real until we can put faces to them. So over the past 2 years in my role as a doctor and as a storyteller, I've interviewed people who live in Northern BC, and I've written about the real impacts this industry has had on their health and their lives, and I'm going to share some of these stories with you. So the first person is Karen Hosford. She is an environmental scientist and a mom. And her family moved to Dawson Creek in 2013 to be closer to nature in a small town. And for a few years, life was pretty good. They would have birthday parties in the backyard. The kids would play on the trampoline and they'd listen to the birds singing. But then fracking started near them in January 2019. And when they used to live in Dawson Creek, they actually recently moved south because, like so many other professionals, they're concerned about the health risks and are able to be mobile. When they were in Dawson Creek, they lived within 3 kilometers of 96 sour gas wells. And on the hill above their house, where her husband used to hike, there's now an open fracking pit and flare stacks. And Karen's house sat at the end of what used to be a little quiet country road that's now filled with constant dangerous traffic from semi-trucks. And when they would lie on the trampoline, all they could hear was a droning drilling sound that would keep them awake at night. And she also alarmingly told us about incredibly high numbers of cancers. She said in an email this year that a 7-year-old girl who was a family friend was diagnosed with brain cancer the prior week, which was the 4th child she knew under 8 who had been diagnosed within the past 4 months. And this is also a story I've heard from Dr. Ulrika Meyer, who was mentioned. She's a Dawson Creek family physician who also noticed disproportionately high rates of a fatal lung disease called idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis in local patients that's fatal within a few years. Karen was shocked that no baseline water or air quality studies were done before fracking moved in, and that still no one is monitoring the changes in the environment now. And I remember her saying to me in one of our interviews, I've worked as an environmental consultant on mining projects from Alaska to BC, and my mind is blown by this industry. If I did these things in my job, I would be fired on the spot. We had a little piece of heaven, and now it's all gas and flare stacks. So on the right here is Head Chief Smogelskem of the Sun House of the Fireweed Clan. And in this story, I want to point out that fracking and LNG development don't only affect people who live in Northeast BC, it's also affecting communities, and especially Indigenous communities, along the pathway of the Coastal GasLink pipeline to the coast, as we saw with the removal of Wet'suwet'en Nation members from their own traditional lands by the RCMP last winter. And we had the privilege of hearing Head Chief Smogelskem speak at Cape BC's Fracking Speaker Series last year, and I'm going to read you some of his words. So he said, I used to teach environmental monitoring in Northern BC and Northern Alberta, and I had an opportunity to visit Fort Chipewyan right in the middle of the tar sands. I was up there teaching for 3 months, and there were young people in my class that were getting diagnosed with rare cancers. The people there were dying at alarming rates. I had to give the students 3 separate breaks through those 3 months to allow them to go back and participate in funerals. That place changed my life. And at that time, there were 13 proposed pipelines that wanted to cross over our territories. I worked at the Unistoten camp for 8 years. One of my friends lived for 11 years on the downtown east side, and I came down to pick him up. He spent an entire winter up in our healing center, completely alcohol and drug-free. He learned to trap, he learned how to eat healthy, he learned how to take care of himself, and he's put on a lot of weight. That place is a beacon of hope for people who are trying to stand up for the environment, but it's also a beacon of hope for people who want to get healthy, and they both go hand in hand. In order for us to make any difference in the climate change that's happening, that's kicking down our front door right now, we need to make sure that we have Indigenous people and Indigenous decision makers taking that lead. We are the ones that are taking the biggest risks because we have a solid connection to those territories. Take anywhere in North America, dig down as deep as you can go. You're going to find genetic evidence of the people who have been there for thousands of years because we've been here for so long. We're here for the long run. We're not going anywhere. We've survived so many things, and we're going to survive this as well, and we're going to win. So fracking can also be incredibly damaging because of how it tears apart communities and pits neighbors against neighbors. And this is something I've heard from essentially every person I've interviewed about fracking. This is Carl Mattson. He describes himself as a farmer, an artist, and unfortunately, sometimes an activist. He's a 5th generation farmer who lives in Rolla, BC with his 13-year-old daughter. And the year she was born, he called the year of the flaring because so much oil and gas activity was happening around his farm. Carl has had sour gas leaks near his house that made him so afraid that he started building bunkers to keep his family safe if and when a major gas leak happens. And he said that one of the worst parts of fracking is the directional drilling. So if you don't let a company put their infrastructure on your land, they will just hop across the road to your neighbor's place, pay them, and then drill down and horizontally under your farm. So a lot of farmers just end up giving up and letting fracking happen because they don't have the time or the energy to fight it. And people who do speak up have to be really brave because most of their wider community works for the oil and gas industry. So Carl has been approached in his own community by strangers who try to pick fights with him because of how he's spoken out against fracking. And unfortunately, because of this, multi-generational family farms are being sold off to oil and gas because children see the struggles their parents are going through and move away. So whenever I bring these kinds of stories up, I always try to share solutions as well, because it can just get, horribly depressing. So I want to talk about what some of the things that CAPE and CAPE BC have been involved in to try to bring this issue to the forefront and try to make some change. So the best thing that you can do is to make some noise. So talk to people about fracking and LNG so it won't be out of sight and out of mind. Write letters and emails to your MLA or meet with them. And here in BC, some of the most important things that we can do are to push our politicians to end the billions of dollars in tax breaks and other subsidies that are artificially propping up the fossil fuel industry. We need to phase out fracking, and we have to transition workers justly and rapidly to renewable energy jobs. Everyone in the North I've interviewed recognizes that the oil and gas industry creates jobs, but dollar for dollar, we know that investments in renewable energy create far more jobs than the fossil fuel industry and are better for the planet. So Here's one example of two examples of what CAPE did. CAPE BC ordered a tour for residents of Northern BC to bring their stories south in the spring of 2019. And it was a multi-city tour that the Watershed Sentinel also helped organize. And so we also, CAPE National released a review of the evidence around fracking in January 2020. CAPE BC volunteers also planned 2 art exhibits featuring the art of Carl Mattson, and you can see one of the bunkers that he created there that's actually functional with oxygen tanks. So we planned this art exhibit this spring, and we actually launched our Vancouver Art Show, as you can see on the right, for a few days before we had to take it down because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So keep an eye out for our relaunch, hopefully in 2021 or 2022 after we're all vaccinated. And this October, we launched the Switch It Up BC campaign, which is aiming to reduce the demand of LNG to reduce the impetus for production. So if you want to get in touch with any of us here at CAPE BC, please feel free to send an email to the organizers and please get in touch with us, because I think by working together as one voice and really bringing, especially in my mind, the health impacts of fracking and LNG development within BC to the forefront, that's how we can change people's minds and make, create a healthier society here in BC. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Melissa. Your work is extremely important because it certainly for me was the first time that I actually met people who were impacted by the industry and heard personal accounts, and I have to say that it's just extremely important in terms of understanding what's going on and the impact and making us feel connected. So I really appreciate your work and the work of CAPE. So thank you. Romain, would you begin to kind of share your screen and get yourself set up?
Of course, yeah, of course.
So everyone, Dr. Romain Chesneux is a professor in environmental engineering at the University of Quebec in Chicoutimi. He specializes in water resources, but he has done an important piece of research in northeastern BC that focuses on methane leakage from the fracked wells, as well as regulations on mandatory reporting and monitoring and the use of protective measures. We've reprinted one of his research papers in All Fracked Up, and it's just a completely key piece to understanding the contribution of the industry to the climate crisis, as well as to human health. So, Romain, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alice and Dolores, for organizing this event. Today, I'm going to give you an overview on shale gas extraction in northeastern BC, and we will look at the impacts of the environment of this industry. First of all, 101 course on natural gas. What we have to know is gas is a mixture of hydrocarbons. It's mostly, of course, methane, CH4, but it's also, gas is also composed of CO2, helium, and sulfide hydrogen, or other gases, but it's mostly CH4. So we distinguish 2 types of gas. We have biogenic gas, which is a renewable gas produced from the degradation of organic matter at low temperatures. Whereas we also have thermogenic gas. That's the gas we will look at in deep formation in northeastern BC. Gas also formed by organic matter a long time, millions years ago, in deep formations at high temperature. Then we have to distinguish 2 types of gas in terms of their locations and how they are in the formations. Is that we have conventional gas, which consists of a discrete accumulation of gas in the subsurface, and we have unconventional gas. That's the gas we will look at for fracking, which is a diffuse accumulation in shale. So the gas is trapped in the microfractures of the rock in deep formations. We find that kind of gas in between 1 and 3 kilometers deep in northeastern BC. So here we have a view on the two types of exploitation, conventional and non-conventional. As you can see on the right side of the slide, the conventional gas is easy to exploit because basically it's in the form of a pocket. So you drill in this pocket and you just leave the gas to come out, degassing by buoyancy and by pressure. So in the case, on the left case, for unconventional gas exploitation, so you have to drill a well in the formation and you have to hydrofrack, meaning that you need to frack the rock by injecting water at high pressures. You inject water, fresh water, 90% of fresh water, and fracking fluids, so that the cracks in the rock will open and the gas will come up to the surface by pressure. And you also have in this mixture of fracking fluids, you have sand, because sand will keep the fractures open so that the gas can come up to the surface. Okay, so let's look at the framework now in Canada and overseas or worldwide, I would say. So on this map, in the red color, you have the gas, you have the locations where we find the gas and the oil mostly in Canada. So basically you have northeastern BC, the region we will look at, Alberta and Saskatchewan are mostly the parts of Canada where you find the big reserves of gas, both conventional and unconventional. So what we have to know is that Canada, in terms of reserves of gas, it is at the 14th place worldwide. Most of the gas reserves are in Russia, in US, Iran, and China. These four countries share most of the gas reserves on Earth. But actually, right now, Canada is the fourth producer in terms of production of gas worldwide. So it means that Canada is exploiting its resources right now at a very high intensity, I would say. Okay, here is a map of the wells installed in northeastern BC, where you find four main formations containing gas. You have the Cordova Basin, the Liard Basin, the Horn River Basin, and the Montney Basin. The biggest basin is the Montney Basin. And in the black dots, you can see the conventional gas, like the pocket gas. And in the red dots, you can see the locations of the fracking wells for unconventional gas exploitation. So in northeastern BC, you have about 30,000 wells exploiting gas from the 60s to today. So as I said, these wells are installed at depth in between 1 kilometer and 3 kilometers. And the cost of one well is in between $1 and $10 million. So just to give you an idea of how much money is injected in this industry. So this graph is showing how the exploitation of gas in terms of billion cubic meters has evolved over time from the 60s to today. So as we can see on this graph, on these curves, is that at the beginning of the millennium, we observed a depletion of conventional gas. So conventional gas is the easiest to exploit and the cheapest gas to exploit. So once it's been exploited, then we came to unconventional gas, but it's more, even though it's more expensive to exploit, to produce. So the thing is, the crisis we are living right now is because the volatility of price of gas. And since the other countries have biggest reserves of gas than Canada, so they control the price of gas. So that's why for Canada, exploiting the gas, unconventional gas, is really costly because we have to hydrofrack again the rocks, and these operations are very expensive. So that's why we are living a crisis right now in Canada in regards of gas production. So now let's look at the environmental issues. I will present two main issues. So one of them is the Wellbore leakage and the fugitive emissions. So it's been already introduced by my colleague previously. But when you hydrofrack the rock, so you will have gas coming out from the what we call the producing tubes, but you may have some gas which escapes along the wellbore outside of the casing. And this gas is a fugitive gas, and it will eventually reach the surface and go into the atmosphere. And as you know, CH4 is 20 times worse than as CO2 in terms of greenhouse gas emissions effects. And the other thing is that we may have these hydrofracking fluids which may come up to the surface. And these fluids are highly contaminated because they have been into contact with the brines. You know, when you add in deep formations, you don't find fresh water, but you find very high, very salty water. And this salt water has to be disposed and treated. You cannot release this water in the environment. And also you have the fracking fluids, which may injure the environment. So you have two different types of pathways for fugitive emissions. So you have, you can see on this slide, that you have outside the surface casing leakage is the fugitive emissions outside of the casing in the vicinity of the wellbore. And the other type of emissions is the surface casing vent flow. Basically, gas is collected inside the casings. You have many casings which are inserted in each other's. And the surface casing vent flow fugitive emissions is actually the most part of leakage that we observe at wellbores. And you also have the cap leakage. Cap leakage emissions is when is only for the case of abandoned wells, because when the well is abandoned, it's capped, but this cap may be not completely impermeable. So you may have what we call cap leakage in abandoned wells. Here is a view of this vent. So as you can see here, you have this vent, this tube, which collects the fugitive methane inside the outer casing. So it's called the surface casing vent flow. And we call these wellheads the Christmas trees. The second issue I want to mention here is the issue in regards of freshwater resources. You need high volumes of fresh water that you find at the surface in lakes and rivers, or in the subsurface in groundwater, in aquifers. You need this water to be injected in for fracking. So you use water, you use big quantities of water, and in the same time, some water may come up to the surface. And this water, as I said before, is contaminated because it's been into contact with the brines. And it's what we call the produced water or wastewater, because it's a wastewater that you have to treat. Again, you cannot release it in the environment. So now I'm going to give you the portrait of in regards of the first issue, the portrait of wellbore leakage in northeastern BC. So from the 60s, we started the unconventional gas production, as I said, and from 1995, we observed the first regulation in terms of detecting leakage. So operators must test wellbore leakage upon abandonment of the well only. So not during exploitation, just before the abandonment of the well, they have to test for leakage. And then in 2010, there was the Oil and Gas Activities Act that brought more regulations, but these regulations are not necessarily enforced. But this regulation consists of looking at at an obligation of declaring a leakage when it's detected, and leakage has to be reported in a database which is managed by the British Columbia Oil and Gas Commission, so the BC OGC. So we have been working at the university with my research team on this database. Actually, there are two databases, but and we have been working on this database because we find all of the gas leakage reported in the database. So it doesn't mean that you have all of the leakage cases. You just have the reported leakage cases. Okay, I want to be clear with that. And we have been published these results I will expose to you really recently at the beginning of this year. And we were the first actually looking at this database, looking into this database. So what the results, the outcomes of our research is that over 21,500 tested wells, 2,300 wells have tested positive, so which correspond to 11% of the wells which have leakage. So these leakages are mostly surface casing vent flow. That's what I want you to remember. It's mostly surface casing vent flow. And we believe that these numbers are underestimated because gas companies are not obliged to test wells frequently. So it's like the COVID-19. The more you test, the more positive cases you will find. So I like this analogy. And there is also the case of abandoned wells. There is no obligation to monitor the possible emissions of abandoned wells. And that's, to me, it's a big issue because when you look at a study conducted by my colleague, Professor Kang at the University of McGill, she was looking at fugitive gas emissions in abandoned wells of Pennsylvania, and she found out that 68% of these abandoned wells were leaking. And that's what we are suspecting in BC to like that kind of rate. So it's more research has to be conducted on the abandoned wells cases. So what are the causes of leakage? We identified two different causes. The first one is the corrosion of casings. Corrosion because, as I said, you have brines in the deep formation, and these brines may come into contact with the steel of the casings and deteriorate the casings. And you also have acids which are contained in the fracking fluids. Okay, and the other cause of leakage is the defective seal. So if the seal is not properly in place, okay, by injecting cement, then you may have some preferential pathways for fugitive gas to come out to the surface along the Wellbore system. So now when you look at the quantity of gas leaking in terms of flow rate, so how much gas is leaking overall. So you can see on this histogram, you have the number of wells on the y-axis, on the x-axis, you have the different ranges of flow rates. What you can see is that most of the wells have leakage rates in between 1 and 10 cubic meters per day. So when you look at the average of the leakage rates, you find an average leakage rate of methane of 5.9 cubic meters per day and per well, which corresponds to 1.4 tons of CH4 per year and per well. And this is also equivalent in terms of greenhouse gas emissions to 35 tons of CO2 per well and per well and per year. Sorry. So the emissions of one car is about 4.7 tons of CO2 per year on average. So it means that one well on average corresponds to the emissions of 8 cars. So since we have 2,134 wells leaking, it corresponds to 75,000 tons of CO2 emissions per year, which is equivalent to the emissions produced by a city of 20,000 inhabitants. So it's to give you an idea of, to make a similarity. And just to complete, we have other possible risks of fugitive gas emissions, because we also find, as I mentioned, the hydrogen sulfide emissions, and you also have explosion risk, I should mention here. So the second issue is the impacts.
Romain, I'm
on
going to
water.
interrupt. Romain, I'm going to interrupt you. A couple of minutes, okay?
A couple of minutes, yeah. So I will be fast on the impacts of water in terms of quantity of quality. So as I said, you have produced water, like and 40% of this produced water is recirculated for fracking, injected in wells for fracking, and the other 60% has to be treated. Okay. So when we look at the quantity of fresh water needed for fracking on this graph, on average, we found out that a well needs for fracking requires 30,000 cubic meters of fresh water. So which is corresponds to 12 Olympic pools per well. So if we look at the 25,000 wells in BC, it means that it's a volume of corresponding to 300,000 Olympic pools have been injected for fracking. So the quality, so we looked at the quantity of water, and here the quality of the produced water. What you see on this graph is the TDS on the y-axis. TDS means total dissolved solids. It gives you an idea of the salinity of water. So to be drinkable, the salinity of water has to be less than 1,000 milligram per liter. So as you can see on this graph, most of the produced water, well, all of the produced water from fracking is way above this recommendation. Okay, so this water is wastewater that is treated, that needs to be treated, of course, before released in the environment. And other issues of fracking is the induced seismicity. And just to finish with that, and to tell you is that now we are looking at the incidence of induced seismicity on the development of leakage. Okay, when you have the induced seismicity due on fracking, you may alter the wellbore casings and you may create more leakage. So that's an issue we want to look at. It's been not looked before already. And we will look at that. And for my conclusions, recommendations, discussions, so the number you want to keep in mind is the 11% of wells are leaking, but this is an underestimation. And what are the future needs? We should put more efforts on the monitoring of fugitive gas, especially in the case of abandoned wells, which have to be monitored on a long term, because in 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, what will happen? How the casings will degrade over time. So a well may not leak at today, but it may leak in 50 years, for example. And future future efforts should be put on field monitoring gas emissions on field. So not only looking at database, but also going in the field and monitor and looking at the potential effects of seismicity on well integrity, as I said. So these are my partners here and our publications. So sorry, I was maybe a little long. Thank you.
Roma, it's a complete pleasure to hear you and to have you with us. This research is absolutely essential, and what I find is that it's a bit astonishing that there is not more of it. That we're calling for this kind of monitoring, and that it hasn't necessarily been going on just in the manner, and nor is the reporting happening in the way that it should be. The absence of data, I think, is a really important thing for us to recognize, and really important that you're doing the work you're doing. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
And stay in touch with us. So I would like now to introduce you to Mitchell Beer. And Mitchell, do you want to put your work up? Mitchell, so we've had a couple of people that I would consider to be kind of muses in this project. Dolores and I, as we've been putting together this book, and I think that Mitchell has been one of our muses. He's been with us. He's been interested. He's been excited. He's been, you know, saying, "Yeah, let's go. Let's do this." And we just seriously appreciate your energy as being part of our project. He's a journalist, a sustainable energy and climate specialist. He began his career as a reporter with the weekly Canadian Native News Service. Somewhere in there was a member of Canada's Parliamentary Press Gallery. He's been a reporter and editor with the Canadian Renewable Energy News and is the founder of the Energy Mix. And that's, I believe, your home pretty much now, which is a Canadian nonprofit that promotes community awareness and action about climate change. In his contribution to All Fracked Up, he really brought into clear focus the financial gamble that British Columbia has been taken on the promotion of liquid natural gas for export. So Mitchell, please take us away.
Thank you so much, Alison. Thank you, Alison, Dolores, for inviting me along on this adventure. I was thrilled the moment you got in touch, and I've been thrilled with this project, with this production all the way through. And if everybody participating in this webinar doesn't already know it, both Alison and Dolores have done such an amazing job in bringing this book to us all. It's just been an honor to be a small part of it. As Alice said, I'm publisher of the Energy Mix, which publishes thrice weekly. We are a free e-digest on climate change, energy, and what we've been calling post-carbon futures or carbon-free solutions. And before I start, I really want to ad-lib 2 points briefly, although that's dangerous with a 15-minute limit. First of all, that after hearing Melissa speak, I really feel you've already heard the most important information in this session, and this was some of the chat conversation as well, just that the health implications of this fracking and LNG crisis are just so profound and striking. And I think such an effective lever for reaching out to people who are not already with us inside the bubble of people who are already concerned about this. I really think, and Melissa, I think I've understood that your work is showing this, that the sort of the first entry point for people to join us is just to think about what this is doing to people, to real life people, as we heard in that presentation. Secondly, from Romain's, I want you to think of what he said at one point, that this process is very expensive, because that takes us into the question of the gamble that BC is taking and the question of how lucky we really feel about all of this. I chose a gambling metaphor for my chapter because sort of in the in-between time, as Alice said, I started my career as a journalist, and actually as a renewable energy journalist beginning in October 1977. Took a rather long U-turn into consulting, and specifically in conference reporting. And through that quarter century or so, spent a lot of time around the meetings and events industry, which I would say very unfortunately is a lot more joined at the hip to the gambling industry than you might think. And so I had a lot more exposure than I would ever have expected to just this assumption in what likes to call itself the gaming industry, that it's all about pulling you in with this illusion that, oh, sure, you can win, you know, but you'll never win if you don't play, right? And there's that's what draws people in and keeps drawing them in. And then I came back into energy and climate work almost a decade ago and began learning about the fracking industry and began seeing the parallels between what I had been so horrified to be a witness to in that sort of interim career and what's going on with fracking in particular. And none of this is to suggest, and I think this is a really important disclaimer, and none of this is to suggest that every fracking operation known to humanity fit that description. But the chapter that Dolores and Alice invited me to produce summarizes some of the really astonishing yarns that are out there, and that have been produced and vetted by other publications as well. What you'll find out is that critics of the industry will often describe fracking as a Ponzi scheme. What you'll find out is that British Columbia in particular is betting on continuing and growing demand for natural gas, or I prefer to call it fossil gas, in Asia. And then that leads into questions about what it would take for the province to actually win this multi-billion-dollar bet. Sorry, it's that too, but in this case, multi-billion-dollar bet that they're taking with taxpayers' money. Whether that's really the way we want to see the province build back better, and ultimately whether it's appropriate for a government of any stripe to be, or of all stripes it seems in BC, to be gambling with taxpayers' money in this way. And I think a point of departure is this definition, and I hate it when people read their slides verbatim, so I'm not going to, but this definition, except that it's a little bit general, is probably not a bad point of departure for understanding how many, not all, but many fracking operations run. And there's just one problem with it. It's the Investopedia definition of a Ponzi scheme, and that I will read out. And so the way that comparison plays out in the fracking industry is the developers promise these massive returns from these big limitless reserves, right? All you have to do is sign on the dotted line and invest your dollars, and we'll start drilling, and it'll just never end until the estimate gets scaled back somewhere along the way, or the well runs down way ahead of schedule. And then when that happens, the developer hasn't made back the original investment yet, and the people who put their money down are getting a little bit watchful and maybe a little bit nervous. So what does the developer do? They repeat procedure. They'll drill the next well, raising money from other investors to pay off the cost of the previous one. Stir, simmer, repeat. And yeah, when it goes that way, I think I've understood that's basically the definition of a pyramid or a Ponzi scheme. The most notable example was reported in May 2014 by the US Energy Information Administration that the Monterey shale deposit in California had come in 96% below the original estimate, and that's obviously the extreme example that proves the rule. But it really does go to the economics of fracking, to the way the industry operates. And I guess I've always felt, and certainly over the last decade or so being back in this work, that what absolutely has to distinguish any solution, any option that we put forward as climate and energy people is that we have to follow the evidence. We have to be diligent. We have to be honest about what we put forward, because frankly, the stakes are far too high with climate, with the energy transition, to get any of this wrong. And to see that not happening in an industry like fracking, it is offensive in its own right alongside the other sort of real world impacts that they have. And there was an account that was published by DSMOG, which is an excellent publication out of the US and UK, if you're not already familiar with them. And they were previously associated with the NARL, which is a whole other level of excellent. But DSMOG carried an account at an industry seminar that took place where a presenter was talking about more effective ways of accurately measuring the geology of a fracking well. And an engineer in the audience stood up and challenged the presenters and said, so if we know how to do this, right? If we know how to not lie to people, if we know how to not overestimate the capacity of a fracking well by 96%, why aren't we using those methods? And a few of the people in the room said, well, it's because we're investors. And then everybody laughed. So in other words, we'll be fine. You know, there's another one more in every minute, and somebody will always invest in our schemes, and we'll be fine. So that was the ethic that story and that laughter really brought to the surface. So for BC's fracking and LNG boom, it's not impossible that some of the projections we're hearing are right. It's just that it's frightfully difficult to separate the diligent data from the reports that are published just to talk up the stock. And at the Mix, we follow fossil industry media on a daily basis, so you don't have to. And you constantly see the projections that are certain and absolute and cast in stone until suddenly they're not. You know, whether it's at a few hours or a few days or a few weeks later, when suddenly reality intrudes. You'll see agencies like the International Energy Agency or the Canada Energy Regulator consistently, reliably overestimating the future demand for fossil fuels and reliably, consistently underestimating the uptake of renewable energy until history proves them wrong. Okay, so that as recently as a couple of weeks ago, the Canada Energy Regulator produced its annual projection of future oil and gas demand. They do that every year. They used to be the National Energy Board. They've been rebranded and reorganized under new federal legislation. And it was so interesting. The top line coverage was some delusional, frankly, projection that oil and gas demand is going to continue growing into the next 15 or 20 years, which for so many reasons we don't have time for today is impossible. But then within hours, somebody looked at the second scenario that they had developed. They called it their evolving scenario. And that was, this was first brought to light, I think, by 2 or 3 climate and energy and community organizations in BC, in fact. But within a few hours, the coverage shifted to the much more likely reality that based on even a minimal future projection, that there would be no further demand ever for the Trans Mountain or the Keystone XL pipelines. You know, so if you imagine the same kind of massive investment in LNG going into the same, and fracking, going into the same kind of massively talked up, excessive projection of what the demand will be for fracked gas in the years and decades ahead to justify these massive investments that take decades to pay off. Okay, then that story about TMX and Keystone really begins to apply to, I think, to what we're trying to grapple with fracking. But even then, one of the really strong critiques of the federal modeling 2 weeks ago was that at no point did they look at a scenario that would be consistent with a 1.5 degree Celsius future under the Paris Agreement. At no point did they even fully factor in the climate actions that the current federal government has been promising for a little over a year, but there's an expectation they'll deliver on it at some point. So even on that very, very basic measure, even the optimistic, from our point of view, even the optimistic projection was way off. So people in our community will make projections, make assumptions as well. It's the way the work is done. But as I was saying before, there is such an obligation on our part, but I would say on anyone's part, to show your homework, to be diligent, to show how you arrived at the conclusions you reached. And that leads into a question for BC of what if the assumptions are wrong? And I have just a few of them on this slide. What if the assumptions that are driving the projected future demand for BC gas, what if those are based on expectations for winter heating demand in Asia that will not pan out over the years? And you'll have to help me out here, but I think I've heard a rumor that we're in a climate crisis and that average global warming is already at 1.2 degrees Celsius beyond pre-industrial levels, and that, you know, maybe we're starting to look at warmer winters when people won't need as much gas for space heating, even if you don't factor in the energy efficiency work that everybody can be and should be doing. What if competing energy sources, renewable energy sources, continue plummeting in price? Energy storage continues plummeting in price. While, as Romain was saying, fracking starts out a lot more expensive than conventional gas. What assumptions can anyone make about the pace of the recovery from the pandemic and what that recovery will look like? And what else? You know, what else is on the horizon? Hands up anyone who had a global health crisis on their agenda for this year until it happened. You know, and obviously we're all hoping that next year will be better, but we know from this is that next year's imponderable. Who knows what unexpected challenges the industry will face next, and that the BC government will face as a result because it is so closely associated with this industry and has been subsidizing and counting on it to such a great degree. So to summarize what it'll take to win the bet, first of all, demand for gas has to recover. Gas prices have to increase. They have to be able to get a better dollar for their gas, but wait, prices can't go up so much that gas can no longer compete with renewable energy and storage when we are already in a place where not only is it cheaper today to build a new solar or wind installation than a new fossil installation, but it's cheaper to build new with solar or wind than it is to continue operating a fossil plant in, last I heard, about 85% of the jurisdictions around the world. So given that, the other thing it'll take for BC to win the bet is that for some reason I can't fathom, the countries in Asia to which they're hoping to sell these massive volumes of gas will have to be willing to pay more than they need to for energy. That same region will have to accept the heightened climate vulnerability that they're already experiencing and that all the projections show getting worse, partly as a result of fracking. And an interesting point, again, from Romain's presentation, in the slide, I thought I saw about a 20-fold difference in the climate impact of methane compared to carbon dioxide. Romain, please correct this if it's wrong in the Q&A, but I know that I think I've understood that in the 20-year period, that's going to be most important as we try to get the climate crisis under control. The difference in atmospheric impact between methane and carbon dioxide is actually 84-fold. So if the region is and needs to be increasingly concerned about the climate impacts they face, the last thing they're going to want to be doing is helping anybody take more methane out of the ground and into the atmosphere. And after all of that, even if all of those factors fall into place, BC has to win a big enough share of that market in spite of the fact that other gas producers are closer by geographically and a lot easier for Asia to tap into. So back home, is this really the COVID recovery that anybody in BC wants? And I'm in Ontario in the other center of the universe, so it's really not my place to say what BC needs and wants, but what I think I've heard from friends in the province that we should all really be living in, is that a COVID recovery does not involve massive subsidies to fossil gas. It does not involve a purpose-built hydro mega project, about which literally books have been written, that largely became, or at least came to be seen as inevitable. We'll see what happens in the next little while, because there was a perceived need for electricity to power the fracking and LNG boom. It should not be a COVID recovery in which that hydro development pretty much wipes out demand for legitimate forms of renewable energy in BC, like wind and solar. It should not be a COVID recovery in which we have good news and bad news about BC's energy efficiency programs. When Efficiency Canada released its provincial scorecard a couple of weeks ago, congratulations, BC came in first among all provinces with a score of 58 out of 100. Right. So, and BC has led the rating in both years that Efficiency Canada has produced the scorecard. It's an excellent scorecard, by the way. But at that level of 58, all that means is that 58 out of 100 is as good as any Canadian province has been able to do on energy efficiency, which is the first essential cornerstone of the transition off carbon. So things may have changed, but I know that when I was in school, 58 was not a mark that I wanted to bring home to my parents too often. It happened, but we won't go there. So ultimately, the question becomes, what if BC invested as if a just green recovery mattered? And if that were the starting point, would we actually be driving this fracking and LNG boom anywhere but into the quickest end possible? Yeah. So to begin where we started, in gambling, the house doesn't always win, but we usually know where it ends. And in the chapter, I talk about people I've met and talked to at length, for whom the family, the household, the multi-generational impacts of gambling addiction go down 4 generations. You know, to the story of an ancestor who could never bring home a paycheck because bad men always took it away from him on the way home. And he wasn't being attacked in the street, but the metaphor kind of worked. He was stopping off at the gambling house. And now translate that kind of story, translate the ghastly things that go on in that industry, translate that image back to the fracking industry in BC and what is being done with public dollars. And I still don't think any of that is as compelling as the health arguments, because I don't think anything is. But I do think it's a really important part of the story, and one that I am so pleased that Watershed said no more. I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Mitchell. Thank you just again for, you know, I actually find this your metaphor one that I can actually deal with in many ways. Like, you know, we know the statistics and we can hear the numbers, but I actually get the metaphor. And appreciate it. It's, you know, in many ways helped me get a grip on much of the information that we hear about the finances of the industry. And again, thank you for your inspiration, for your help with doing this. Now, we're going to sort of move into a series of questions and a bit of a question period here. There are a number of questions that have come in the Q&A. If you would like to add more, please do. We will try to get to them. We may not get to all of them, and may actually try to answer some of them after the session. I don't know for sure whether that's going to be possible, but we'll see. Just to very quickly go over a couple of things as you're thinking about this. I believe likely now all know that you can order the book, All Fracked Up, from Watershed Sentinel from the website. So that's watershedsentinel.ca. We're going to do another session in January that's similar to this. And know that its focus is going to be on the connection between fracking and Site C. We've had a number of the activists who are involved in Site C sort of connect with us, and we're beginning to kind of plan that session, so stay tuned. And I thought we should mention that there's a webinar tomorrow that's taking place. There are a number of environmental organizations in British Columbia, including My Sea to Sky, which is opposing the wood fiber LNG plant in Squamish. They're putting on a session on tracking fossil fuel subsidies in British Columbia. And that was part of the effort that got sort of focused on during the BC election, where we thought that actually if we went after this question of how much we are subsidizing the industry and made our politicians really have to speak to that, it may be a very effective way into exposing a whole range of issues and problems with this industry. Somebody, I believe, Corey or Dolores, are going to put up the connections to that webinar in the chat. So before we move into the question, I just really quickly want to thank you guys, Melissa, Romain, and Mitchell. This is such a rich conversation, and really appreciate your time with us. I also really think we need to, thanks to the folks who've helped put this together, Sarah, Claire at Watershed Sentinel, Corey here, the Glasswater Foundation. So they are all the people who have helped make this possible. So Dolores,
yes,
are you ready to go with the first question? We're going to try to organize these. So
yeah.
do you want to go with the first question?
Yeah, there's perhaps the simplest one or the hardest one. There's a lot of questions around what are the options. People are pointing out that we've got our homes all plumbed with gas. So what are the options, and what can consumers do about this? That people are looking for a consumer action. So I don't know who wants to take this.
I'm happy to start,
Okay.
just because of the CAPE's campaign,
Yeah.
Switch It Up BC, right? So I don't know if a lot of people know this, but here in Vancouver, about almost 60% of our fossil fuel emissions or our greenhouse gas emissions come from burning LNG, or burning natural gas, not LNG, burning natural gas to heat our homes and water and buildings. So 60%. So if we want to take action on reducing our emissions here within our city, we obviously have to target the demand side for natural gas. So I mean, they're actually bringing in, they just voted in the Climate Emergency Action Plan a couple weeks ago. And one of the main planks is to significantly reduce the amount of natural gas burned within these buildings. And so essentially, they're bringing in a mandate for people, essentially when their heating systems come to the end of their lifespan, they will need to replace it with electrified heating, with a heat pump instead. So something that you can do on an individual level, for example, is if you have a natural gas stove, use it less often. Like, unfortunately, because of the subsidies of fossil fuels here in BC, electricity is more expensive. But one thing you can do, for example, is use a pressure cooker, or use a portable induction hot plate to cook. So not only is that better for your indoor air quality, but you're also not burning natural gas. And then from the heating side, I think one thing that we have to do is kind of pressure our governments to provide us with the tools, provide us with the subsidies, to be able to more affordably switch our homes over and switch our buildings over, because that's what we need to do here in the city anyway, to really take action on carbon emissions. So combination political pressure to improve subsidies for individuals, and then also just reducing your own use in simple ways.
All of the above, and there is a funding opportunity, a funding stream that's opening up, but it's not quite there yet, and it needs to be done better. For most of the last year, we've been hearing some excellent advocacy, beginning with a researcher in Cobourg, Ontario, named Ralph Torrey, on mass deep energy retrofits. And the idea is not just to do what we usually do and what the federal government actually did in the fall economic statement, which is to throw a few $1,000s at home retrofits, and what could possibly go wrong? That's got to be a good thing to do, right? There is some research, and there's and a few demonstration projects going back a decade now, showing that if it's done right, home energy retrofits, first of all, can get much more in the way of energy savings, and secondly, work on the basis that once you go in to do anything at all, do everything, and that includes trading out gas for heat pumps, as you said, Melissa. There's been fierce advocacy directed at the federal government under the heading of a just green recovery, to not just introduce any old retrofit program, but to really do it right, to organize it better, to have it run larger, to have it create orders of magnitude more jobs, and along the way to replace gas with heat pumps, so that we do end up doing, which is something that's one of the most important elements of any low carbon scenario, and that is basically electrify everything. So it's doable, and they're headed down that road. But what they offered in the fall economic statement was a $5,000 grant for people to do more superficial retrofits. That's not landing well. They're taking a lot of criticism for it, and there is an opportunity, I think, to push towards the more complete programs we need.
May I complete the answers? Thank you. Yeah, I fully agree with my colleagues. The thing is, the annual world consumption of gas is 3,400 billion cubic meters per year. And we estimate that the BC reserves of gas are 10,000 billion cubic meters. So it means that the reserves in BC will sustain during 3 years the worldwide consumptions. So it means that you have no choice to find new energies than non-renewable energies. So we are facing a problem for which we have no choice to change. There are many ways to change. We can combine different sources of renewable energies. We already developed some technologies for that. And we also have in the same time to reduce our needs. We have no choice for that. That's my, I'm convinced of, yeah.
That's a very important piece. Yeah, yes.
Okay, the next cluster of questions comes around emissions. And I'm going to just read off the questions, Romain, and then let you kind of answer them all at once, hopefully. One is, shouldn't producers be required to monitor the whole perimeter of their well sites, since leakage may be other than the wellhead? And the person says, obviously the answer is yes. Are there any laws proposed? And someone else asks, is this a constant rate of emission that you were talking about, or variable? And another question is, the oil and gas companies say they will mitigate leaks. What is their agreed success rate? And I think that's enough.
So 3 questions and maybe enough, and then we can go to next questions. But okay, there are 5 different types to detect leakage in the field. That's a good point, that we should maybe extend around the wellbores, extend the monitoring of gas emanation. But again, what we found out is that most of the leakage occurs along the wellbore, so in the vicinity of the wellbore, as a surface casing vent flow. So 90% of leakage is surface casing vent flow. The other question is in regards of the rates of leakage, if they are constant or unconstant. Yeah, it's a good question, because you may test a well for leakage at one time and you will get a negative test. You come back 6 months later at the same site, the same well, you test it, and then it's positive. And you test it later, and it may come back to negative. So it's a little bit like, again, I like to make a parallel with the COVID-19, because some wells are not symptomatic and some are symptomatic, and some may leak at one time and may not leak at another time. So it means that to monitor properly leakage, we should have a constant monitoring system, because again, these the leakage rates may evolve over time for different reasons. As I said, if you have seismicity, it may start new leakages. If you have new injections in the vicinity of the well you're looking at, because you're developing more wells around this well, so you may develop leakage, whereas there was no leakage detected before. And the third question is how to mitigate leakage. Well, it's not a question of technology. We don't have any technology yet which allows to completely avoid leakage. I think we have to live with leakage, because it's not a matter of technology. There is no, the way we mitigate leakage is by injecting cement. So at the end of the lifetime of the well is in between 1 year and 3 years. So after its production lifetime, then you have to decommission the well and eventually abandon the well. So the way you do it is that you inject cement in the wellbore so that it will prevent future leakage. But a 100% prevention is never feasible. Again, because the system may evolve with time. We may have mechanical and chemical degradations of the casings of the cements. So it's a constant evolution system.
Okay.
So there's one, just I think one question that I think would be useful to have clarify. Just it's the question about what proportion of our current domestic market is fracked gas, and then if we continue to just service our domestic needs, does there need to be an expansion in fracked gas? To what extent does the local market need LNG, which is the liquefied natural gas? So it's just to kind of clarify kind of where we're at and those questions. Somebody want to take that?
Well, I can maybe give a few points. I think gas should be used as a transition source of energy. Again, since we won't have gas anymore in a few decades, we still have to develop new energies, new sources of energies that may require consuming energies for their own development. So we should use these remaining gas on Earth for developing new energies. So for transition, so that's what we should consider. Right now, there is a big project that you may have heard about. Well, it's not started yet, but it's in evaluation assessment. Is this big pipeline, in between BC, Alberta, and actually my place here in Quebec, in Chicoutimi, where they are developing this project of liquefied gas that would be exported to Europe. Okay, because Europe there is no gas in Europe basically. So Europe imports its gas from Russia. So, but Europe don't want to be dependent on Russia. So that's the reason why they also put pressure for getting the Canadian gas and US gas. Okay, so there are some political aspects, geopolitical aspects that are not necessarily presented. Well, it's not my part because I am a scientist, so I won't go into political aspects, but we have to know that behind this kind of project there are like politics, and as I said, the gas reserves are shared between North America and Russia, Iran, and China mostly. Okay, so and we can understand that there may be some tensions, in between these two big blocks, so that's something that has to be considered too.
If I can just come in quickly to pick up on the beginning of that, and that is that if we're going to be looking at gas as a transition fuel, the two cautions are, first of all, that is precisely the spin that and I'm not saying you're doing this one at all, but it's the spin that we've been hearing from the gas industry forever, that, oh, we're a bridge to a renewable energy future. They also claim they're clean and green. So we could all take lessons from them if spin is what we want to learn. But I guess the other point is that, yes, I mean, we're not going to turn over 100% of our energy use overnight. It would be nice, but it's not doable. If it's transition plan, though, I think the most basic price of entry to that is to actually say, here's what the transition is going to look like. Here is the point at which we are going to consume the last increment of gas. And here is how we are, first of all, going to massively ramp up energy efficiency so that we're cutting demand to start with. And alongside that, we will massively electrify so that there is no further need for that gas, which again takes us back to our nasty energy retrofits, but I won't repeat that rant, and there was much rejoicing, that rant rather. But if it's transition, we need to know what it looks like, because frankly,
Yeah.
that's been the language for so long, and here we are.
Mhm. Okay, so there's a lot here. People are very engaged. I'm loving this conversation that's happening in the chat and the questions. But there are a couple of questions that we want to take, and then I think we're going to have to close. One very quickly. Does anyone know what type of radioisotopes might be found in the produced wastewater?
I know that you have uranium. I'm not. I don't have the list ready in mind, but you have uranium. You may find uranium, that kind of isotopes.
Uranium.
Yeah.
And
One
radon.
source I can recommend on this is Robert Howarth, who's a researcher at I'm blanking on the university in the northeastern U.S., who gave a presentation in the last decade or so talking about radon gas in fracking formations in the northeastern U.S. that, if used to the max in New York City, would have driven up lung cancer rates like mad. And I'm sorry to be so general about that, but it was a different shale formation. It was a decade ago almost, but that's a source to look into, because I know that Howarth and his lab have not stopped their work on this. They've been wrapping it up.
If you want a popular story about radioactivity and fracking, if you Google Rolling Stone fracking radioactivity, there's a really kind of striking article about that in that publication. So I would encourage you to look that up.
Okay, thank you. Dolores.
Oh, yes. Somebody was asking if it would be a good strategy to get the insurance companies to stop insuring these fracking companies. Although I wonder if they are insured, they're making such a mess. So that's sort of a strategic question. There's been quite a lot of success with that around the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Anyone? Nope. Okay. Mitchell, what do you think? You're probably more on top of that part of the industry.
Just to echo your point that there's been a lot of focus on insurance companies on pipeline and tar sand projects, and with some success. It's taken the industry a long time to figure it out. The campaigners, I think, are doing a really good job on it.
I think it's interesting, though, too, how the federal government, as kind of part of its COVID-19 recovery plan, stepped in kind of as an insurer. You know, like one of the first things that they did in terms of economic stimulus was to provide funds to clean up orphaned and abandoned wells, you know, in Alberta. So anyway, I don't know. If you target insurers, it almost seems like the government may step in anyway, because it needs to happen, right? Like they need to be cleaned up. But yeah, so it's interesting who steps up when things go belly up and the costs need to be put towards cleanup.
Maybe a good thing to do would be to pressure the government to increase the safety deposits. I don't know what they're called, but I know in mining, you have to put cleanup money up front in a savings account or something. And the oil and gas has a fund like that, but it's nowhere near adequate. So it would be pretty fiscally responsible to try and get the government to increase those deposits.
All right, so I'm going to close us here, this session here, knowing that there are a lot of questions, there's a lot of discussion that still needs to be had, and just hope that we are all able to be finding the places where we can have these conversations, you know, where we can have our questions sort of debated and answered. There are many organizations, there are a number of organizations that are doing this right now. CAPE, the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, is definitely working on this stuff. Mitchell is munching on this. I suspect constantly. There are academics across the country who are working on these questions, Romain being our representative today. And we know in British Columbia, there are a number of organizations that are beginning to kind of try to open up these conversations. So let's all of us be paying attention. Again, the current political move is to try to hold, to make our politicians talk about why they are supporting this industry with subsidies. There's the webinar about that tomorrow. I think again, just to remind you to see if you can write a letter to Dr. Bonnie Henry about closing down the camps during COVID, and not just the ones along the Coastal GasLink, but the Site C camp and the one down south. I've forgotten its name. Again, because the same issue is happening in all of them. And to finish, the Watershed Sentinel website will have a recording of this session up on it. I don't know whether we've got an answer yet from Romain and Melissa and Mitchell about sharing their slides, but I know that they will be available on in the recording, and you can order the book from watershedsentinel.ca. So,
and stay tuned, because in January we're thinking of pulling together a webinar on Site C and LNG.
Yeah,
and sort of trying to bring the whole picture together.
Yep. Okay, so thank you. We'll close now. Thanks for being with us. Okay.
Good night, or good morning, good afternoon.
Whatever time of the day it is.
Yeah, right.
Romain, thank you so much for being with us. Mitchell.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.